Well, hello again, everybody, and thanks for tuning into the podcast for the second episode. Glad you liked the first. But actually, if you haven't heard the first one, you can definitely pause this and go back and find that one if you want to. Last time we interviewed Mike Callahan over in Massachusetts, USA. Told us a lot about beaver management, how to work with beavers when they're clogging your culverts, and weird things like golf balls that you might find in a beaver dam. And it was a really good time. So go check that out if you haven't. This is the Methowbeaverproject podcast. We're located in Washington State, north central Washington State, in the beautiful Methow Valley. And we are all about beaver restoration, promoting beavers to the public, and getting more beavers on the landscape where they need to be. My name is Josiah Shaver, and I'm your host. And today we are with Dr. Emily Fairfax. And I'm very excited for this discussion. A little bit about Dr. Emily Fairfax. I would describe her as a rising star in the beaver industry for sure, because she has some really exciting research that is just coming out about beavers and wildfire. She has a PhD in geological and earth sciences from University of Colorado Boulder. And since 2019, she's been an assistant professor at California State University, Channel Islands. She is also a science communicator, which I'm all about science communication. I guess that's what we're doing here today. But she made a awesome short stop motion animation video about beavers and wildfire. You can find it on YouTube. Just type in like Emily Fairfax, stop motion animation, wildfire beavers. It'll come right up. It's super fun and cool. It's got 24,000 views, published 2 years ago. And yeah, definitely check that out. And yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and get started with discussion with Dr. Fairfax. First question, I guess, is can you tell us in your own words what you do and where?
Yeah, so I do a lot of different things. I'm a professor, and so my job is both research as well as teaching and mentoring and outreach and service and all the other 1.5 billion things that fall under the umbrella of professor. And so on one hand, when I'm in the classroom, I'm working with undergraduate students and teaching them how to write codes or how to use GIS softwares or how to make good data visualizations. And then I leave the classroom and I sit down at my own computer, and that's when I start studying beavers. So I'm out here in California, coastal California right now, and there are beavers out here. There are beavers all over North America and all over Eurasia. So it's kind of a cool field because everywhere is my study area. And most of my work is remote sensing. So I do like going outside and I like going to the field, but when I'm doing my work, I'd say 90% of it's at the computer. And I'm accessing satellite images, I'm accessing historical records of aerial images, I'm accessing weather data, all sorts of these different kinds of data that are already just out there, and sort of piecing them together to understand how beavers change the landscape, especially when it comes to climate change, because things are getting much hotter and much drier and much more fiery. And there's some pretty compelling evidence that beavers can help us out in that realm.
That's awesome. I'm kind of curious, do you teach remote sensing or what classes do you teach?
Yeah, I teach environmental statistics, which is a combination of statistics and learning to program using the language R, which is very popular amongst ecologists. I'm also working on a version of that class where they learn Python instead of R, because both are good languages to know in the field. I teach Intro to GIS. I teach data visualization. I teach water resources management, and we just added an elective, which is remote sensing. We haven't gotten to offer it yet, but it's now an official class, and I will be teaching that as well.
That's fantastic. Cool. Okay, so we know a little bit, at least an intro of what you do, but I also want to ask you why you do it. What motivates you to do this work with beavers?
It's a good question. I mean, part of it is I think they're awesome. So it's really fun work to do. I like puzzles. I like answering questions, and any kind of research is kind of like that for me. So getting to have a question and then sort of piece together all these different puzzle pieces to find the answer. So personally, I think that's fun, and everybody should have fun with their lives and do something they enjoy. And I enjoy doing that. Another side of it, though, is that I have lived in the American West for the last decade or so, and it's very hot and dry here, and that can be pretty stressful. And you see, more fires, more droughts, more everything, and you want to be able to help. And there's not a lot that I feel like I can do in my individual, like my life, to change climate change. Like I can do the little actions and I can be an advocate and campaign and whatever, but like personally, the actions I'm doing don't feel like they're seriously changing climate change. But
Mm.
when I study beavers, like that gives me hope, because I can see these beaver ponds in my research acting as drought buffers and acting as fire buffers and creating these refugia. And there's not just one beaver I'm studying, like there's one of me, like there's millions of beavers out there all over the landscape. And so thinking about them and studying them, it does give me some hope when there's so much doom and gloom about climate change, that there are solutions out there that are sustainable, that are doable, that are practical. And being part of studying that, it's fun, it gives me hope, but it's also, I feel that I'm contributing to like a better path forward, both globally and in environmental science as a discipline. And just with like letting beavers be beavers, they've had a pretty rough past in North America, so it feels good to help with their conservation efforts as well.
Yes, that I could not agree more with the hope of beavers. That's I'm an intern here for the Methowbeaver project, and that's one of the big reasons that I decided, beavers are awesome because of what they do, but they're also very helpful for intimidating things like climate change, like you said. Can you tell us, maybe where you grew up and how that influenced what you do now with Beavers, Wildfire, and maybe at what point you got interested in beavers in the first place?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. I've grown up all over the place. I was actually born in Mexico City, Mexico. My parents were diplomats working there. And then I was very young when they moved to Texas, and then Indiana, and then Michigan, and then Arizona, and then Minnesota, then South Dakota, then New Mexico, then Colorado, now California. So I've lived all over the place. I don't think I've ever lived anywhere for more than 7 years. So uh, I move a lot. But in doing so, it's been really cool because I have seen a lot of different landscapes. And when I was a kid in Indiana, in elementary school, we'd go on all these field trips to wetlands and marshes. And I have so many clear memories of going there, and like they'd pull out like a little box turtle or something and they'd be like, look at this creature, it only lives in wetlands. Isn't that amazing? I'd be like, wow, that is amazing. Look at these cattails, they only grow in wetlands. Isn't that amazing? And where I was in Indiana, like it was corn. Like that's the landscape. It was just corn. But then we go to these wetlands and these little marshes, and it's like booming with life, and it was incredible. And then we moved to Michigan, and also like a very outdoorsy culture there and lots of different, more sort of foresty landscapes. Learned about beavers in the fur trade, but didn't really think about them that much. A few moves later, I'm in Minnesota and I'm leading canoe trips through the Boundary Waters. And this is like a college job. And there's so many beaver dams up there. And I'd never really thought about beaver dams before until I was up there. And then my thoughts were like, oh my gosh, I have to portage over another stinking beaver dam. Like, I gotta drag my whole canoe over this. I gotta get all the girls over this. Like, we gotta try to not irritate the beaver because then they follow you and they slap their tails and they're like, stop going over the dam. And I'm like, I'm trying. So that was also like, it was impressive. Like, those were big structures, and I'd never seen one like that before. And so it was kind of an impressionable moment. But uh, I was in college and I was taking out student loans, and I was like, I gotta get a job after this. And I did not know that there were jobs in environmental science. I was just not exposed to that in my upbringing. So I had majors in chemistry and physics, and I went to work as a weapons engineer after college. And it definitely paid well. It helped with the student loans. And it was interesting in that I got to really push my knowledge of chemistry and physics, but I like wanted to be outside, and I wanted to do something that had to do with the outdoors. Like it was constantly lurking in my brain that like I didn't want to be in the weapons lab. And I was like sitting on my couch and feeling mopey about it. I'm going fishing every weekend every lake I can find in the area. And then this documentary, Leave It to Beavers, comes on PBS, and I'm watching it, and it's just incredible because they're talking about all the stuff that beavers do, like nature documentaries always do. But then they interviewed all these hydrologists and geomorphologists, and they were saying, like, there are so many questions we still have to answer. Like, we don't know what they're doing in this kind of situation. We don't know what they do in the desert. And then there's this aerial view of beaver wetlands in Nevada where it's just bright green in the beaver zone. And then as soon as you're out of it, it's all crunchy and dead. And I was like, what? There's questions you can still answer about beavers? I thought like beavers were solved. I didn't know. And so like I couldn't get it out of my brain. So I started doing some Googling and I'm like, is this true? Is this like, are they just kind of saying that to get you excited about beavers? But it was true. Like you Google it and there's very little there. And you go on Google Scholar and you go on all these like scientific source websites and there's just not a lot of information. So I was like, well, I guess I got to go to grad school and study beavers. And I did. And it was great that that worked out for me. And I have not turned back since. I still study the beavers. I'm still obsessed with them. Is definitely the right choice. Like I've wanted to be about a million different things as a career throughout my life. Like I was going to be an astronaut, and then I was going to be a chemist, and then I was going to be all these other things. And I never really got into it until I wanted to study beavers. And now I'm like, I definitely want to study beavers. This was 100% the right choice. Finally found that career direction, touched a lot of fields that were interesting but not long term for me, and now here I am talking about beavers on a podcast.
That's awesome. Wow. Well, we're glad you found beavers as well. But I have to go back and ask because I'm super curious. Weapons lab stuff. Are you allowed to say what you did, or is that super classified?
um, some of it is very classified, but I was in a weapons engineering group that worked on what's called the Stockpile Stewardship Program. And so the US built a bunch of nukes back in the day, and now those nukes are just chilling because we don't use them, which is great. But as anything ages, as any material ages, it changes on the atomic level. And so I was using my chemistry and physics background in a material science context to understand how the different components would age and to make sure that if it was ever needed, the stockpile would be ready, but also that the stockpile did not become a safety hazard on its own. Like we don't want it to start leaking radiation or something wherever they're sitting. So just making sure that all of those components are intact. And so while I was in a weapons lab, most of my actual work was looking at like little chunks of metal, being like, how's that little piece of metal doing? Does it look
Yeah,
okay?
nice. Okay, cool. Also want to go back to getting over beaver dams in a canoe. Did you know that Lewis and Clark wrote about that problem when they were like in the Oregon Territory? They were I don't know if the language that they used specifically said that they were very frustrated, but that's the impression I got when I wrote that section.
Hard.
They had to get over a whole bunch of dams because beavers. There was way more beavers in Oregon, many parts of the world than North America than there are now, and they were traveling on the river trying to get to the ocean.
Yeah. And you don't think about like you think about Beaver Dam, and you're like, oh, it's not that big. And maybe the last few Beaver Dams you went over had like maybe a 2 foot drop or a 3 foot drop on the other side. But some of these Beaver Dams, you like paddle up to it and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing is 5.5 feet tall. How am I like, what do I even do? Do I push the canoe over and then like jump? There's sharp sticks down there. Like I'm not going to jump into that water. Do I go all the way to the edge of the whole stinking lake and like portage around? No, that's going to add like 45 minutes to my trip. And so you're like turning the beaver dam into this weird slide and you're like sitting in the canoe going down the beaver dam and you're like, I hope this works. Seems like it should, but you never know.
Yeah,
Um, and like they're I mean obviously they're very strong structures, like a moose can walk across a beaver dam and it's fine, but that doesn't change the fact that you're standing on it and you're like, what if this is the time when it collapses and like I'm in this wave of sticks? It never
mhm.
happened and it'd be super unlikely for it to happen, but it's definitely hard getting over some of those beaver dams. Like, they're big.
Wow. Yeah, I have not personally seen any that are that big, but this is Minnesota.
This is in
Probably have.
Minnesota.
Yeah. Wow. Have you been
I
to
think
the
the biggest beaver dam, oh, I was gonna say the biggest beaver dam I've seen is actually about 10 feet tall. And that one was in Colorado, which was, I would not push a canoe over that. That's danger. I'd find a way around. But they can get huge. I know there's even bigger than that in Minnesota. Some of these really lowland environments where there's like a pinch point in the landscape, because they're not getting super intense flows every year, it doesn't blow out. So they can just keep building it taller and taller and taller until you get this like turbo dam. It's incredible.
Whoa. I didn't know they got that big. Like I've heard of the, I don't know, half-mile long dams. But okay, so this one that was 10 feet, how long across was it? Do you have any idea?
It was only about 30 feet across. It was like a little nick point in the landscape, and the beavers just dammed it all the way up. It's really rare for them to be that tall, because
Yeah.
at that point, it's hard for the beaver to keep building on it. Like beavers are big, but they're not that big. And so they have to either like find a way to hold on to really long sticks and then climb the dam, which is really challenging, or like drag a stick to the upstream side and like push it over to add to it, which is also challenging. Like it becomes really difficult engineering. It's like they graduated and now they're in the grad school of engineering and it's hard. Um, so like at that point, sometimes it's not worth their effort to keep building it taller. I think the average height of a beaver dam is like 2.5 feet tall. So these mega dams are definitely abnormal.
Yeah. Man, that's awesome. I'm gonna have to go find some more pictures of the biggest beaver dams ever. That sounds like a good Google search. I was gonna ask, have you been to the Methow Valley up here in Washington?
I don't think I have. It's definitely, I've seen pictures of it and it looks gorgeous. But I haven't been, I've only been to Washington once that I can remember, and I've only been to Oregon once. And until I moved out to California, I hadn't been here very often either. So the whole like actual West Coast is fairly new to me. I'm more of like Midwest and mountainous West. So it's on my to-go list.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we'll have to have you up here at some point. That'd be super cool. Do you have a favorite beaver story? I guess we're kind of already talking about the crazy parts of beavers and big dams and stuff, and you mentioned getting over beaver dams in your canoe. Anything crazier than that?
Mm. I mean, it's always fun when you see weird stuff in beaver dams. They are great at using whatever comes their way. And I've been to beaver dams that are on the more urban side, and I've been to ones that are in forests. And honestly, both of them can get some really weird stuff in it because it's whatever's washing downstream. And so I've been to a dam that had like tons of flip-flops in it. And it was weird. I was like, why are there so many flip-flops here? And then I thought about it, and that dam was downstream of a section that people really like to go tubing on. And that,
Mm,
so I'm sure they lose their flip flops, and then the flip flop either gets stuck in the dam or the beaver picks it up and it's like, I'll use this. I've seen traffic cones in beaver dams. I've seen a baseball. I've seen flashlights that still work. I've
whoa.
seen a lot of coolers and trash, which is like, I feel mixed about it because it's like, well, it sucks that there's trash in this river, but it's kind of good that the beaver collected it for us and is building with it. But it's also a little bit gross that the beaver's building with trash. But like, who am I to tell the beaver what to build with? That's not my job. So it's always fun going to a new dam and there being like a little surprise in it, like, oh, look at that. One of my colleagues works almost exclusively on urban beaver dams, and she has posted some just amazing pictures of like basketballs and creepy dolls and like old umbrellas and like much larger scale trash in beaver dams. It's I think those stories are always fun because people are like, what's the weirdest thing you've seen? And I'm like, it's not the dam itself, it's what's built into it. And then I imagine like a beaver dragging a traffic cone, and that's a very fun mental image of it. Like, I think it washed downstream, but I don't have proof that the beaver didn't go like steal it from a construction site, which is just like would be hilarious.
Yeah, that'd be pretty funny. Wow. Um, okay, so your main research, at least right now, I read your was it 2019 paper? No, it was 2020.
Mhm.
I just read that on Beavers and Wildfire. Would you mind kind of giving a summary of what you did and what you found?
Mhm. So I had studied beavers in droughts before, and I actually was so obsessed with that documentary that I saw about beavers and the aerial shots, that my very first like field site was that aerial shot. I wanted to see like, did this actually stay greener? Like how much greener? And so it was a drought-stricken landscape, and I studied it, and I saw that when you had beavers, the plants stayed very green, even if you had a drought. And then the natural follow on to me then was fire, because when you have these fires in the West, they're often preceded by a large drought or even a short drought, but a drought. Everything gets dry and then it catches fire and then it burns. So I wanted to see if when you have beavers, does the vegetation stay green enough that it won't burn or that it'll burn less? And so I used remote sensing, I used satellite images to look at 5 different big wildfires. Well, I thought they were big. I don't think they're that big anymore, which is a little sad. It's just like a couple of years old. Uh, but anyway, I was looking at these 5 fires that had a bunch of beavers within them, within the perimeters. And I looked at the vegetation through these beaver dammed areas and also on streams that didn't have beavers. And I looked before the fire happened. So like if a fire was in July of 2019, then I would look in July of 2018. Then I'd look when the fire was happening, so July of 2019. Then I'd look after the fire happened, so like July of 2020. So the 3-year span for all of these different fires. And what I wanted to see was if you have beavers, does it just stay consistently green or is it going to be affected by the fire? And then how does that compare when you don't have beavers? And what I saw was kind of surprising, honestly. I expected beavers to make some difference in the system, but they are a rodent, and these are big wildfires. And so there's kind of like a power imbalance there, or at least I thought. And what I wound up seeing was that if you have beavers damming up the landscape, they store so much water in their ponds and in the soil and in the canals, and then ultimately in the vegetation that's being able to continue to do photosynthesis and stay green and stay lush, that those beaver dammed areas were burning 3 times less than if you didn't have beavers. So essentially the beavers were giving you 3-fold protection against the fire. If your fire comes through and obliterates a stream without beavers, the stream next door that has beavers is maybe only just lightly burned or not burned at all. And I saw it in every single fire I studied. And I saw it on all sorts of different terrains and landscapes. I looked in forests, I looked in grasslands, I looked in shrublands, and it was just across the board. These beavers were making these big soggy patches that didn't burn. And so they were creating what's called refugia in the fires. These are patches in the landscape that, while everything else has like kind of literally gone to hell, it's not burning. Like it's green, it's lush. It's a place where animals can hunker down. It's a place where the vegetation can stay intact. And then that little patch is preserved. And after the fire can spread back out and take up that landscape that has burned.
Wow, yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask you also about, so a beaver dam complex, at least as I understand it, is a series of beaver dams that might be, a quarter mile long or longer. And I've heard it said that wildfires will sometimes be stopped by beaver dam complexes. Do you know how likely or how common that is? Or do you have is there any research on that specifically that you know about?
Nothing published. I know in my study, in one of the fires I looked at, it did look like the fire got halted by a beaver dam complex. But I will put a caveat on that. That beaver dam complex was like 750 meters wide and many kilometers long. So it was huge. Like it was a whole hill slope turned into beaver dams. And so like, of course, that's going to make a difference. Like that's an enormous patch and there's not a lot of fire conditions that can go over that. But that is really what it's going to come down to is the fire conditions, because the way that any of these kinds of sort of land-based fire breaks work is you create a patch where it's hard for the fire to ignite the next thing. And whether that's concrete like a road, or if it's a river, or if it's a parking lot or a reservoir, if the fire can't catch there and there's not enough wind to blow it over, then it'll stop the fire. So the wider it is, the better. The longer it is, the better. But if you have one of these mega fires that's creating its own weather system and there's like lightning striking everywhere, that's not going to stop that fire. But if you have a brush fire or a grass fire or a relatively low intensity forest fire coming and it's not spitting embers 2 miles away, then you have the potential for that beaver dammed complex to act just like any other fire break we make, whether that's with mowing the lawn or mowing the hill slopes and making those big bands of low vegetation, whether that's roads. People use highways often as temporary fire breaks when they're trying to do firefighting, or big rivers, which it's all the same concept. It's not going to burn, and the wider it is, the more conditions it can resist. So I think there's a lot of room for research on that. I'm definitely trying to understand more on my side with modeling, how much beaver damming do you need for given fire conditions? So if you've got this fire and it's
Oh,
kind of
wow.
like medium strong, like how many beavers or how many beaver dams would you actually need to stop that fire?
Huh. Yeah, wow. Yeah, I hope I'm around. I'm sure I'm gonna be around. I'm gonna be looking forward to that, reading that article. Um, Speaking of fires, I am in Twisp, Washington, where we're based, Methowbeaverproject. And we recently had, well, actually, we still have three fires that are burning. Last I heard, they're about 40% contained. And I don't think you can see, I have the windows behind me, but it's whited out. But it's smoky today. Um, and yeah, that's one of the reasons that we're, of course, trying to get more beavers here as well. Can you talk a little bit more about the refugia part of beaver ponds and complexes and how those work in a fire?
Hmm. So the way that they work is it's just like a pocket that is being protected because it's so wet, which is good. And in my research, I look at vegetation health indices, so seeing how healthy the vegetation is, because vegetation is the foundation of most ecosystems on land. Like you need to have the plants to feed the animals that feed the other animals and so on. So if the vegetation's doing okay, and the temperature's not like a trillion degrees, then that means that habitat is somewhat preserved at least. And then that kind of data can be paired with photographs with on-ground observations. I've got this great photo of a black bear just chilling in a beaver pond, like right after a huge wildfire came through. So it's some proof that at least animals do go to the patch of landscape that's not charcoal. I mean, if you've got these plants that are still intact and they're still photosynthesizing, those are making plant smells. And then any creature that wants to live with plants can probably smell those plant smells. When you've got water that's still running, a lot of creatures go towards water because they need it to survive. And if you think about post-fire landscapes, especially in severe fires, like the trees are burned, the grass is burned, the soil is burned, animals are going to want to avoid that sort of charcoal burning nastiness. And so they're going to go away from the smells of smoke and fire and towards the smells of habitat that they recognize. And if that habitat happens to be beaver ponds, which I've seen it be, then they can just wait there. And as long as that ponded area is wet enough and, you know, large enough to withstand whatever fire is coming through, then the animal can just wait, and just let the fire pass. If you think about what the West looked like way back, before European colonization, we had so many more wetlands on the landscape. I think California has lost 90% of its wetlands, and the West is something like 70 to 80 to 90, depending on what state you're in. So we've lost most of our wetlands. And these were not all like a river delta on the coast. It was a lot of wetlands along the way have been lost. And if you then think about a fire back when there were that many wetlands, there were probably a lot of places that animals could go to wait it out. Like,
Mm.
how did animals survive half a million acre fires in the past? Well, they probably had somewhere they could go. They didn't just obliterate whole animal populations. Like those animals are still alive today. So where did they go? How did they escape? How did they survive? I think that having these healthy riverscapes, having wetlands, having rivers, having streams that were in a much more resilient state probably contributed to not quite so dramatic explosive fire behavior, but also more patches of habitat being preserved so that after the fire, animals can go back out in the landscape, and during the fire, they can avoid the flames. Not every animal can escape fire. If you're a fish or a frog or some small mammal, like you're not gonna get out of the fire's way. You don't have that ability. You're too slow or you're constrained by your habitat. And so then the only way for those species to really thrive under heavy burning conditions is to have a patch that they can wait it out in and then go back into the rest of the landscape afterwards.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I want to ask you about the phrase Smokey the Beaver, which is part of your article. Did you come up with that? And what's the story behind that phrase, Smokey the Beaver?
Well, obviously, it's a play on Smokey Bear or Smokey the Bear. I've gotten into so many weird arguments with people about if it's Smokey Bear or Smokey the Bear, because his name, I guess, is technically Smokey Bear. But then there was a popular song that called him Smokey the Bear. And then I argue that Smokey Bear is a bear. So Smokey the Bear is also accurate. But that it's like a whole thing, and people get really defensive about it. They're like, if you're going to make fun of the bear, at least get his name right. So I'm like, okay. But I mean, the first time I used the phrase, I think I was talking to a reporter. I was doing like a little lecture for a local library about beavers and fire. And I was like, oh yeah, beavers are like kind of out there fighting fires, like Smokey the Bear, but it's Smokey the Beaver. Uh, and then they were like, wow, that's great. You should say that at your lecture. And so I was like, all right. And I did, and it got in people's ears, and they asked me about it. And so I realized like maybe by using a concept that people are familiar with, like Smokey Bear is all about fire prevention, and
Mm,
beavers are not about fire prevention. They're about sort of fire management. You don't want to stop fires altogether, but you do want to have them in a more sustainable and, you know, functioning way. You don't want these fires that destroy ecosystems. You want fires that help ecosystems. And so I was like, all right, well, what if we rebranded Smokey Bear? Because people already think about like the bear, the fire, and then making fires less damaging. And now it's Smokey Beaver. But I didn't want to make it just Smokey Beaver. So I was like, what if there's a copyright or something on this?
uh,
Like, I don't know. I don't think there is. But in any case, he's Smokey the Beaver. His name is not Smokey Beaver, it's Smokey the Beaver. And it was just a way to get people to talk about it in their own social circles, to get people to feel comfortable interacting with my research. The
mm,
worst kind of scientific papers, in my opinion, are ones with titles that are like, I don't know, a complex modeling and remote sensing analysis of fire behavior pre, post, and during fire using Sentinel-2 and Landsat-8 satellite and DVI. And I'm just like, stop. No one is going to read that. No one knows what that means. Like, you got to make the title clear what you're talking about, or that research is going to go die in the ivory tower. And I don't want that for any of my research. I want the titles to be clear. I want it to be apparent to everybody what I studied and what I found. I don't want there to be like secrets that you don't get to know unless you're a PhD scientist studying fires. And so to me, Smokey the Beaver was a way to make it clear that beavers are related to wildfires, and it's in a positive way. They can help with wildfires. And then from there, I mean, people liked it, so I kept saying it. That's how most of my talks go. If people like it, I say it again.
that's fantastic. I love that so much. And I agree so much about like the making the science more relatable for the general public. Science communication. I think I already said it. I love science communication, all about that. Um, okay. Beavers and wildfire. What are some of the common misconceptions, things maybe people think that aren't true, or that you found a lot of people are like almost right about certain things? Or yeah, what are some common misconceptions that you found?
Um, well, I think one of the big ones is that if you build a beaver dam analog or a BDA, that you will recreate everything that beavers do that help with fire. And I think BDAs can be great, and they're really good restoration tools, and they do mimic some of the things that beavers do. But there's a lot that beavers are doing in that landscape to help make it fireproof or fire resistant that a BDA cannot mimic. And so that's an unfortunate misconception, because I wish we could just recreate all of it. I wish we could do it ourselves and make our own beaver dams and accomplish everything. But building a BDA does not dig the canals out through the landscape. It does not chew down the trees and keep you constantly turning over your biomass so that it's not these super old growth trees that are sort of drying out and shutting down and dying of diseases. It's not adding wood chips into the soil as they chew. It's not doing overblank flooding persistently down these canal networks, half a kilometer away from the main pond. And it's not maintaining itself. And so having the beaver in the landscape, I think, is very important for fire prevention and fire resistance and fire resilience, because there's a lot of different behaviors that beavers have that are contributing to this ultimate, very healthy riverscape that can deal with different disturbances, whether that's floods or droughts or fires. The beaver's doing a lot of work. We can do some of that with the BDA, but not all of it. Another misconception that I hear that's just like the most common one ever is that beavers eat fish. And they're like, but if the fish go to the beaver ponds, won't the beaver just eat it all? And it's like, no, they don't. And Chronicles of Narnia totally ruined this. And the movie came out, they had those beavers serving fish. And it was like, no, there's a whole generation now that's going to think beavers eat fish. They don't eat fish. That's the big summary there. They're vegans. They just eat plant matter. If the fish go hang out in a beaver pond, they're not just like swim into the buffet for the beavers. It's not like that. Um, I mean, those are the two big ones. Is like we can do it all ourselves. We can't. Um, Beavers are doing a lot in the landscape for us, and unless you want to sign up to be a full-time beaver and go like cut down sticks every day with a little tiny axe and make sure you leave enough wood chips in the ground to help retain soil moisture, and you're patching the dam and you're digging the canals, like we can't afford that. That's why beavers do it, because they're free.
Yeah.
People have to be
Okay.
paid.
Hmm.
um, but then also like the animals that are potentially able to hunker down in beaver dams and beaver ponds, like they're not being harmed by the beavers when they go there.
Mm, yeah. I'm glad you brought up that. It's funny because I talked to Mike Callahan in the last podcast episode, and he also mentioned the beavers don't eat fish thing.
So common.
I know. Well, I grew up watching Narnia and assumed, oh, of course beavers eat fish because that's what they did in the fictional movie.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, that's good. And and it's kind of the opposite because beaver help fish so much with the juvenile fish habitat and the slow water refuge and bigger pools and all this stuff. Um, yeah, and you mentioned the economic side of beaver restoration not costing, compared to hiring a fire crew, right? Can you talk more about that and what our governments could be saving if we had more beavers?
So many dollars. There was just a cool article in the Sacramento Bee about this. And there is a project up in Placer County where they're going to do some stream restoration, partially for fire resistance, but also just to make it a healthier landscape overall. And they, instead of doing the sort of hard restoration where you bring in, big tractor things and diggers and all sorts of stuff like that, and you do all the work yourself, they went down the path of more process-based restoration, more low-tech stuff, and they put in wood into the rivers and they built BDAs. And then beavers showed up because that's what beavers do, and the beavers took over. And I did an interview with NPR Los Angeles about this, and I loved the way she phrased it. They were the only engineers that come in under budget and ahead of schedule. And so they restored the riverscape in, I think it was 3 years when the project was estimated to take 10. And the total cost was in the low tens of thousands instead of 1 to 2 million. And so there's an enormous savings, both in terms of time, which is very valuable, especially as these fires are increasingly intense every year, but then also in dollars. And so if you were going to spend 2 million, 1 million, whatever dollars to restore a riverscape, and then the beavers do it for a tiny fraction of that, that frees up so much more money to go do this in more riverscapes and to really sort of spread out that money instead of concentrating it in smaller areas. Because ultimately, there's a lot of rivers in North America that are in terrible, terrible shape and really need restoration efforts. But restoration can be really expensive when people do it. Engineers are expensive. I've worked as an engineer. I know what their salaries are. Heavy equipment is expensive. Planning is expensive. Permitting is expensive. But if you've got beavers or you've got BDAs that beavers take over, that can be extremely cheap because the beavers are free. And a really great paper out in Mammal Review in 2020, I think it was October 2020, put a dollar sign on the ecosystem services that beavers provide, whether that's carbon sequestration or non-consumptive recreation, like people going and fishing in beaver ponds, extreme event moderation, so floods and droughts and fires, all of those things combined every year. If you have an acre, or sorry, if you have a square kilometer of beaver dammed riparian zone, so think about a stream and like you squish it out and you got a big square kilometer, it's $69,000 a year that the beavers are doing there every year just by
Whoa.
being beavers. Like you don't have to tell them to do it, they just do it because that's their behavior, that's their instinct. And so if you can scale that up to the amount of riparian zone that California has, that Oregon has, that Washington has, that any of these states have, if you fill that with beavers, or if you allow beavers to recolonize those landscapes, you're talking tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in ecosystem services that are being performed not by us. And so then that money can be freed up to help with the kinds of things that beavers cannot do, because beavers work in riverscapes. They cannot go deal with these massive forests that are on the hill slopes. And so that frees up funds to, do prescribed burning, do cultural burning, do more indigenous land management, can support those efforts because we're not spending all the money getting a backhoe to come in and dig up this river and drop a single boulder in the middle or something and hoping it fixes the waterway. Just let the beavers do that, put our funds and our brilliant engineering brains on a different problem.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I actually read an article. This was just a non-scientific article by Heidi Perryman, who's huge beaver advocate, also in California. And she was, it was almost a scathing reprimand about, how much money we're spending on like wildfire fighting, the industry that it has to be right now. That could be slightly less if we used beavers more. She also called them nature's wildfire fighters. Um, yeah, so you talked about like river restoration and the money saved from that. What about like actual damages preventative damage loss from beavers and wildfires spreading less? Do you have any sense on how much we could be saving or anything like that?
Probably a lot. I would argue that the fire problem we have now, where fires are not behaving in a way they used to in the past, because we've suppressed them for the last 100 years or whatever. It depends landscape to landscape why the fires are a problem right now, but a lot of them are. I think that the budget that's allocated towards fire management in a lot of cases is appropriately high. But I think we could accomplish more with that budget if we partnered with beavers. Because right now, like I'm pretty sure California's firefighting agency, CAL FIRE, just said that like currently we have so many fires burning and they're so intense that we need to dedicate all of our fire services towards the active wildfires. And so there's going to be a pause on these other fire management things we do, including prescribed burning. Like we don't have the time, the budget, the availability right now to do that because our big fires are too out of control and we need more management there. And so that's a shame to me because that is like, if you think about like medicine, like that's treating like a critical symptom right now. Like we got to do emergency medicine on these fires. And by dedicating our resources towards that, we're not doing the kind of preventative care, the daily checkups, the little things that keep you healthy along the way. So all of those little things like the prescribed burning and the thinning and the other kinds of restoration we can do in forests, it's not getting done because the budget's being spent on fighting gigantic wildfires. And so I think let's keep the dollars flowing into forest management and fire management. It's great, but partner with beavers so that those dollars can go so much further. Because then instead of taking 10 years to reach the goal we want, maybe we can do it in 3 and the money can be spent in other ways.
Right. Yeah. Do you know what it would take to have like CAL FIRE or another group? I don't know. There's a lot of groups that could kind of take this on, but what would it take to start reintroducing more beavers intentionally in like wildfire prone areas as a piece of the puzzle of wildfire prevention or
I think it's
mitigation?
gonna probably take some more research. I like my study and the studies I've seen on droughts and fires, they're very observational, which is expected. Like we don't go put a beaver in a landscape and then start a fire all around it. That seems kind of grim. Um, but I do think that there needs to be more work done figuring out like how many beaver dams do we need? How many beavers? What are the places, the specific locations in the landscape that would get you the most restoration for the least amount of conflict? Because there are conflicts that people have with beavers. Like it might be a perfect spot for beaver-based restoration, except for the fact that someone lives right next door and it'll absolutely flood their basement every year.
Mm,
So maybe that's not the best place to start. If so many spots of our landscape could benefit from beavers, we should do some research to figure out which ones are the best case for us to put beavers in, which ones are going to give us the most return right now. And then that kind of research that's really targeted and really specific can help agencies like CAL FIRE decide like, okay, we can support beaver-based restoration on 100 kilometers of stream. Where should we put them? How do we do this? Like that still needs some more work. And I think the kind of work it needs is someone saying, okay, go do it on a small scale and collect some data and see how it went. Like do some beaver dam analogs in a landscape and see how much fire prevention you get from that, and then compare it to a nearby spot that has actual beavers. Like what is the gain that you get from having active beavers versus having just beaver dam analogs? Because as much as I'd love to see beavers in every single stream, they don't live in some places anymore. Like they don't live in our cities
Mm.
often. Sometimes they do. And then there's a lot of conflicts with people. But figuring out where we can put them, figuring out where to maximize their benefit. I think that kind of data and that kind of research could really move the needle in terms of getting some of these larger fire management agencies on board, because that's actionable science. That's like a direct, you put a beaver here, you will see a benefit.
Yeah. You kind of just answered like my next two questions. I was going to ask you about, what's next in research, and this is good. Um, okay, so how about this? Can you talk about the role of academic research versus the role of, say, a nonprofit, like maybe Methowbeaverproject, trying to do similar research? What are the limits of each, and how can we best work together?
Limit on everybody is funding, isn't it? Research costs money, research costs time. And so I think no matter who's doing it, that is usually the limiting factor on research. And one of the things that is really great about seeing nonprofits partner with academics, who partner with state agencies, who partner with large funding agencies, is that you can put all the pieces together. You have academics who are maybe a specialist in a really specific model or software or technique that unless somebody went and got their doctorate in it, like you're not going to know how to do that. A lot of academics are really specialized and can answer really specific questions. But then you got to have access to the land, or you got to have access to the people who are actually involved in doing that kind of science. Like I'm on my computer most of the day. I'm not up there relocating beavers. I'm not up there evaluating every beaver habitat in a parcel of land. So you got to know who cares? Is it the local community members? Is it a land manager? Is it a land trust? A lot of nonprofits that I've worked with, they have those connections. They built those relationships. They're more place-based, and they sort of understand the needs and wants of their local community and can help direct academic research towards questions that people actually care about. Because like left to my own devices, I could study the most useless things. I would find it interesting probably, but it wouldn't do anything. And that research isn't going to be helpful. And so by sort of bringing those two groups together, you can make sure the research stays on target with something that needs to be done. And then you get in the state agencies, the federal agencies, the big funders, and that's where you can see the research sort of scale up. And instead of having this be like a little test site that we did on a little parcel of land that someone was kind enough to let us instrument, you can, involve more people, involve more land. Look at this large scale. What if we had an entire state full of beavers? What would that look like in terms of fire spread? And how does fire behavior change if you can scale this up huge? Those kinds of really big questions require a lot more resources. And so that's where you need that, I don't know if it's like a trifecta or a quadfecta or whatever, a lot of groups working together to get that science done. And it's really nice seeing that happening more. I think in the last 5 years, especially, I've seen, at least in the beaver community, a lot more partnerships between all these different groups. I'll see papers come out with 5 authors on it, and every author is from a different sphere. You've got someone from nonprofits, you've got someone from academia, you've got someone from like the Forest Service, and then you've got someone who's like a local land manager. And they all wrote a paper together about science they did. And that is the coolest thing to me, because I know that science is not going to go die in a library somewhere where nobody ever sees it again. That science was done for a purpose and can be used as an example for other groups of who might be interested in doing something similar.
Yeah, I love that too. Okay, how can we get more people on board with beaver restoration and more people knowing what beavers do for the landscape? What do we have to do to get that information out there? And I guess, I don't know, get more beavers.
Talk about it constantly, never stop. I personally talk about my work a lot, and I like talking about it. It's exciting. But pretty much every contact I get, or someone who's like, you should talk to this person, I'll at least have one conversation with them. And I'll be like, okay, why do you want to talk about beavers? Like, what's your interest in this? And sometimes they're just personally curious about beavers. And then it's great. Like, we had a conversation, they talked to a scientist, I talked to a community member, little tiny partnership was made, and then it's over. And it's just like this wonderful, ephemeral little thing. But then sometimes I'll talk to someone and they'll be like, wow, that was interesting. I need to introduce you to this other person. And then that other person's like, let me introduce you to this other person. And then before you know it, you're talking to the mayor of the city. And they're like, how many BDAs do we need? And you're like, wow, this really escalated. Um, but it's the kind of thing where, like, honestly, if you were just to walk up to someone on the street and be like, did you know that beavers can save us from climate change? Like, they'll think you're pretty weird. It's if you like you don't if you read that somewhere, you'd be like, that's kind of weird. That seems like kind of a weird idea. But getting a chance to talk to someone about it who can explain it and who can answer your questions is huge. Like, so many people just want to know how and why, and they want someone to explain it to them because it is a weird idea. Like, it's not something you grew up hearing about, like hear about fire engines or, those helicopters that come scoop up water. You don't hear about beavers being a fire management technique.
Hmm.
And so being able to talk about it with people and build those connections and talk to all the reporters who then go turn strange garbled tangents into beautiful, like, journalistic stories, that I think is really important. And anybody can do that. You don't have to be a scientist to do that. If you've learned about beavers, go tell someone else about beavers. Like, make it so it's not so weird. Make it so when you're like, hey, did you know that beavers can fight fires? Your friend will be like, yeah, duh, everybody knows that. That's the goal. Like, whenever you have a new way of doing something, you kind of have to normalize it before everybody gets on board with it. And that's fair, because especially in North America, there used to be a lot of beavers, lots and lots of beavers before the fur trade. And then there were very, very, very few. And so there are people who are outstanding conservationists and really, like, conscientious about the land and the environment and everything. But when they grew up in Oregon or in California, there were no beavers anywhere near them. And so now they're seeing beavers come back into this landscape, and their gut reaction is like, this isn't what this land is supposed to be. This is weird. This is wrong. And I heard the term used, ecological amnesia, for this, which I really
Hmm.
liked. And it's like, we've forgotten what this actually looked like before the fur trade, before beavers were wiped out. We don't remember what the streams were like when they were chocked full of beavers, when there were, up to 400 million beavers on this continent. And so helping people who have good intentions understand that beavers were here and that they're coming back is not bad. I think it was in 2013 that people finally agreed beavers were not invasive in California, which blows my mind. Like, what, 5 million years ago, beavers were walking around North America and they saw the future and saw the state line and they were like, can't cross that. Gotta stay out of there. It doesn't make any sense. But it was just like this persistent misunderstanding. And until enough people were like, no, they were definitely native here. Like, there's the word for beaver in dozens of native languages. There's pictographs of beaver. There's fossilized beaver specimens. Like, beavers were here. We're just finally getting past that barrier because people had just forgotten. They've been gone for so long in this landscape. People forgot what they were and what they do. And so talking to people and that outreach, that education component is huge for moving the science forward and moving the practice of beaver-based restoration forward.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy and good. What are the next steps for you in your career? Are you looking to do more beaver stuff? I think you mentioned what you're currently working on, but what does it look like for you in the next 5 to 10 years?
All beavs all day. I'm still very interested in beaver science. I am really interested in continuing down the beavers and climate resilience pathway. I'm definitely looking to partner with more ecologists and more field folks who, when I come in with my satellites and say, I'm pretty sure the beavers, did some serious work here preserving this landscape, I would love to have partners who are more trained in field ecology be able to go out and say, like, hey, you're right, there were 15 different species of water bug that were fine here. I don't even know what water bugs are called other than water bug. So, like, building out that collaborative network is definitely towards the top of my list. I'd love to be able to bring together more of those kinds of data sets with my work, especially when it comes to fish. There's lots of work being done on the relationship between beavers and salmon and beavers and trout and things like that. I want to help sort of tie the bow around the relationship between beavers and fish during fire. I want to be able
Mm,
to see, like, how well is that fish habitat preserved, because people are really interested in fish. They're another keystone species for us. A lot of the salmon are, especially. And so when you have a fire, like, does the water stay cool enough? Does it stay clear enough? What about all that ash that comes into the river after the fire and can smother fish when it gets on their gills? Like, how does the beaver damming influence that process in the landscape? So I'm definitely interested in finding more ecologists to help me out. I'm very much a physical scientist. I'm like dirt and water and satellites. So working with people who are more about, you know, the biology side of things, I think will really help my research move in a very cool new direction.
Yeah, that's awesome. I forgot to say in the intro, I also did undergrad in geology or geological science, and somehow I'm working with beavers. And last summer I worked with fish, and I love it. It's so good.
Yeah.
But I'm learning a lot. Um, anyway, okay. As we kind of wrap up here, I wanted to ask you in just a few sentences, how do you summarize the key points of what you want the listeners here to remember and take away?
I think the three big key points are that beavers are native to almost every type of stream in North America. They've been here for a long time, millions of years. They're still here today. And when they change that stream, which they do really dramatically, it's not a bad thing. People really like these tidy streams. Like we imagine a stream and it's like little single thread, clear water, small, tidy little trees on the edge. Like that's not, in most cases, a healthy stream. A lot of times streams are messy and you get poison oak trying to get into them and you get scratched by all these plants you don't even know what they are because it's just booming with life. And so when you see that messy, sort of chaotic system when the beavers move in, like that's good. The chaos is good. The messiness is good. That's one really big point. Like we're programmed to like landscapes that are sort of tidier. So like way back in our evolution, we were like, we got to see the predators. But we don't anymore. We can let the beavers have their chaos because that chaos is great. The second big thing is that there is very real potential for beavers to significantly accelerate restoration in our landscapes. Like they come in under budget and ahead of schedule, and that's amazing. And I really love that phrase because it's so true. And it's really good to embrace that, but I totally understand where people are coming from when they're nervous because the other thing people really like is to have control. And when we sort of embrace beavers as our partner in restoration, we lose that control because they are another creature that is out there doing the work and we don't control that. They're not a robot, they're not a tractor, they're an animal. And we have to sort of sit back and let it happen. And that can be hard for us. So I get it. That's the other second big point is like, I get it. It's hard to do, but it's a good thing. Trust the process. The river can recover with the beavers without you. And then the last one is talk to people about it. If you see something cool, and definitely with beaver science, but with science in general, like talk to people about it, share that news. There is so much doom and gloom and climate grief, and it can be really hard to think about the future and feel like you can make a difference anymore. But if you see something and it's like beavers fight fire, or beavers help in droughts, or even just like lots of butterflies were seen in a beaver pond, like tell someone about that. That's great. Share that news, build the momentum behind this, because whether we like it or not, the kinds of things that get funded, that get momentum behind them, are the things that people talk about. They're the things that people care about. And if everybody just sort of ignores beavers as a restoration partner, then it's not going to go anywhere. We have to talk about it. We have to make it clear that it's a real thing and it can happen and it can happen cheap and free and fun. And like, it's not weird. It's real. And we should definitely embrace it more than we are right now.
Sweet. Dr. Fairfax, for everybody who wants to learn more about your research and follow what you're doing, how can they do that? Where can they find out more?
So I have a Twitter that's a nonstop stream of beavers. It's all beavers all the time. And it's at Emily Fairfax. You'll know when you find it because it's a picture of me and beaver dams for like my profile and header. And then my website is also a good place to find out more about what I'm doing. And it has a contact me button on it if you want to ask me a question specifically. And that is emilyfairfaxscience.com.
Fantastic. Okay, here's the joke. What did the river say when it saw the beavers coming?
Damn.
Yep. Well, damn it. Um, Dr. Fairfax, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your expertise here and this piece of hope, really, that beavers are. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And for everybody tuning in, thanks for listening. Once again, this is a podcast of the Methowbeaverproject. If you want to support what we're doing here at the Methowbeaver Project, you can do that. A large part of our funding is from donations. So you can check out our website, methowbeaverproject.org, to learn more about that. I'm your host, Josiah Shaver. If you guys have feedback for us on this podcast, on a past podcast, or maybe even who you want us to interview next, we would love to hear it. You can reach us we actually have a phone number you can call, 509-289-2770. I'll put that in the show notes as well. You can also email us at methowbeaverproject@methowsalmon.org. That's a long one. You might want to find it in the show notes. And you can also check out our website. Please leave us reviews, like, share, subscribe. You know what to do if you want to spread the word about beavers. And yeah, tune in for the next episode. Thanks, guys.